If you grew up watching 1980s Saturday morning cartoons like I did, you may remember breakfast cereal commercials that advertised their sugary products as part of a well-balanced breakfast, often narrated over a shot of milk being poured, but with a tall glass of bright orange juice by the bowl's side. Other advertising often cemented Florida orange juice branding in my adolescent memories. But the orange juice industry is and was broader than that. Perhaps you're familiar with Southern California's Orange County. It's named that for a reason, and historian David James Gonzales' new book, Breaking Down the Walls of Segregation, Mexican-American Grassroots Politics and Civil Rights in Orange County, California, examines not only the citrus industry, but as the title makes clear, its connections to racial segregation and civil rights battles. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Renson. Our conversation with Gonzales about these early 20th century histories will change how you view Orange County, and hopefully inspire you to re-examine the urban histories of where you live as well. Thanks for listening. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with authors from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. It is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, am Associate Director and a Professor of History. My goal as host is for these conversations to spark your curiosity about and interest in thinking more deeply about the region's lands, cultures, and peoples in the past and present. This is a one-man operation, with me serving as host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am trying to make up for that with my passion about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more about it and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for gain, but increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using, write a review, follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information on my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects and funding opportunities that you could apply for. And with that, let me introduce who we're talking to this month and why. David James Gonzales is Assistant Professor of History here at Brigham Young University. He holds a bachelor's in history from UC San Diego and a master's and PhD in history from the University of Southern California. His research bridges Western, urban, immigration, and civil rights histories, among other intersecting subfields, predominantly focused on Southern California. He has received numerous awards and honors for his scholarship, including a prestigious 2021 fellowship from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, a 3-year Butler Young Scholar Award from us at the BYU Redd Center for Western Studies, and more recently, the Martin B. Hickman Belonging Award from the social science colleges here at BYU for his work with and dedication to multicultural students. Gonzales is active in numerous professional organizations and was just recently named as a board member of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. If you listen regularly to author interview podcasts like Writing Westward, you may recognize his voice, as he is also a producer and a host of the New Books in Latino Studies series from the New Books Network podcasts. Gonzales' new book that we discussed today, Breaking Down the Walls of Segregation, Mexican-American Grassroots Politics and Civil Rights in Orange County, California, was published by the University of Oxford Press in 2025. This study turns our attention to an understudied region of Southern California, Orange County. It is often overshadowed by Los Angeles and San Diego, but Gonzales shows us how developments in the citrus industry in Orange County and the histories of racial segregation that attended them had significance far beyond the county itself. Key issues that enabled early 20th century citrus growers in the county to become so economically successful were their collective economic cooperation, the vertical integration of their businesses, and their ability to insert themselves as the power brokers and decision makers in nearly all facets of county social, economic, and political life. But a key factor in their ability to do so was their attracting and settling of Mexican and Mexican-American families as a multi-generational labor force. This led to segregated communities, and by extension, segregated schools. These segregated educational spaces became a focus of Mexican American political organizing in the 1930s and 1940s, leading to a landmark class action lawsuit that forced county school districts to desegregate. While Gonzales's work is tightly focused on Orange County, its conclusions have broad significance. He demonstrates through bottom up social history how the loftiest of American ideals, constitutional rights, equality, and protection of freedoms, are often secured for everyone through the efforts of community and collective grassroots organizing at a local level. Here, immigrant communities engaged American legal systems to insist that supposedly enshrined constitutional rights actually be protected for all. This is a thoroughly Western story in so many ways, and similar investigations could be made in countless Western locales to uncover other overlooked bottom up histories. In a historical moment when polling shows that faith in American institutions is quite low, there is hope in the reminder of the power of community and its abilities to reform and strengthen those very institutions that might seem to be crumbling. Professor David James Gonzalez, welcome to Writing Westward.
All right. Glad to be here, Brendan. Thanks for having me.
I feel like we should admit to listeners that we are actually right now on the same campus, different buildings, but only a few hundred yards from each other. But just to record this, it's easier to be in two different rooms. It is a little weird though.
Yes, it's funny.
Um, well, to get started, can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with the West as a region from your own personal history?
Oh, this is a fun question. Um, well, I was born in Southern California, so that's certainly part of the West. I did my graduate training. I mentioned that because we had an institute at the University of Southern California where I did my graduate training in. So it's the Institute for California and the West, right? So very California centric version of the West, right? But certainly, but that is my view, if you will. That's my lived experience from Southern California. I mentioned that because everything's east of Southern California. So growing up was kind of fun in that whenever where was every again, I mentioned that more because, like, everything was east to me, so my concept of, like, the West was kind of that, like, we're on the tail end, California's on the far, western side of obviously the country. I mean, if you there's Hawaii, of course, but, the of North America, and so all of that, grew up in Southern California, 2 counties primarily. I was born in Oxnard, California, strawberry capital of the world, and pretty much split my childhood and youth between Oxnard, and then we moved to San Diego when I was around 10 in the early 90s. And so the rest of my adolescence was in Chula Vista, California, actually, which is very close to the US Mexico border. So my view of the West is very much a borderlands view of the West. How much that came to me was mostly, I think, in my, again, adolescence, later, youth years. Again, we moved to San Diego when I was 10, so I have very good cognizant memories of noticing the distinctions between southern San Diego County and Ventura County, and the border was always looming. Um, and so the border, very much, the US Mexico border, of course, has been a very large part of my life. I have ethnic Mexican background on both of my parents' side. My mother was born in Mexicali, and but raised in the United States. She had an American father and a Mexican mother. And my dad, his family mostly comes out of northern New Mexico, southern Colorado for several hundred years. So the border crossed them, but Mexico is quite prominent in that history and their lived experience. And but all my education was in the West. Again, Southern California. It started in community college at Southwestern Community College in my hometown, Chula Vista. Did some other community college work. I had a professional um, career in that eventually led me to doing financial mortgage banking. Was self-employed for a while and came back to academia to finish my degree after the Great Recession, and finished up at UC San Diego. That's my undergrad, and then USC, as I mentioned, is where I did my graduate work, and
It's funny for people who grew up on the coast like you and me because we were the most west geographically. But growing up, I did not think of myself as a Westerner or the things that I associated with quote unquote the West or Western identity, Western history wasn't me. I viewed myself as a Pacific Northwest thing, and that was something very different. You viewed yourself in California, borderlands context, and for both of us, the rest of the quote unquote West was actually East. So growing up, did if you would to hear like, "Hey, we're gonna go watch a Western film," or "Hey, you're a Westerner," like what would that have conjured up in your mind before you got to grad school and started really critically thinking about the region?
that's such a great comment and question because so much of my view of the West was shaped by television. My mother was a very big fan of kind of 50s, 60s movies. And, we never really had cable television. So we are always watching whatever, really old, outdated stuff was on the TV. So, my parents, or my mother at least, and with my grandmother, funny enough, if they weren't watching Mexican novelas or Spanish language novelas, then they were watching what would be the equivalent of, I don't know, well, AMC channel is very different today, but back in then it was all the black and white movies, right? So very Western centric, right? John Wayne, if you will, cowboys, and or Cary Grant, which has its own kind of Western feel now. I didn't think about it back then, but I would see him as like right part of that Western archetype, masculine man,
But did you
and
identify with that at all, or was
of
this a
course,
foreign
no,
thing?
no, it was a
Yeah.
foreign thing because that's what my view of the West was. I was a Southern Californian, and that wasn't West, in that mindset. And even all grew up with funny thing is, um, when, in Oxnard, I mean, I grew up again, the TV I'm watching is like very old reruns. So the Lone Ranger in black and white was on still very prominent and on television, and I loved it. I mean, I had like I think 2 or 3 Christmases in a row where I'm receiving or I'm getting the, Lone Ranger, rifle and 6-shooter cap gun set, and our old like family videos of me running around with a 6-shooter and a rifle.
But then you go to grad school, you start thinking critically, and yeah, your Southern California upbringing does not resonate with, say, John Ford westerns and so forth. But we all think critically now about how it is part of the West in lots of very important ways, maybe that weren't depicted in although I guess Zorro, that was kind of a
Yes.
Western and kind of California, but also very much its own thing. Um, but anyway, so your book has some obvious links to this region where you spent the whole early part of your life. Although I guess you were born in Ventura and then you grew up then in San Diego County and then you went to grad school in LA County. So all of the Southern California counties, except for the one that you wrote your book on, but surrounding Orange County. Um, and I'm always interested to ask people about the path that led them to the topic because the book that we think we're going to write, or in this case, the dissertation that then becomes a book, is never what we end up writing exactly. So, what were the research questions that started you on this path? And then how did they transform into becoming the actual research question that you land on, which is the history of how the citrus industry in Orange County leads to widespread segregation and then the resistance against that segregation? How did you get there?
Yeah, great question again. All I had this was so much top of mind when I was finishing the book that I began my acknowledgments by explaining this. I was saying that although I've been born and raised in Southern California, and I've never lived in Orange County, the place that has become, the focus of my scholarly work. And I mean, I even lived in Riverside County too. That's where I had my business for almost a decade. So how I get to this topic is really a story of my intellectual development as an undergrad. I eventually I said I started at community college and developed an interest in history because I had an interest in politics and social issues and debated between poli sci and sociology, and at some point, I think when I'm about to transfer to UC San Diego, I think, okay, history, I think is what I'm going to do. Cause I'm thinking more like a teacher. What do I want to teach? And this is after my career as a mortgage banker. And so I want something much more permanent and intellectual, and I want more freedom in my type of thought. And so I settle on history, but I don't settle on Southern California history until I'm at UC San Diego. And I take this class taught by Danny Widener at UC San Diego. And he's an LA historian on the Black Arts movement. And I just took that class because I needed a summer class that met a history requirement. Back then, I was still debating, like, oh, am I going to be an early Americanist? Maybe I'll do early American religious history, or starting to get interested in indigenous Native history, particularly. And his class on the history of LA. Funny enough, my dad was born and raised in LA, and I'm a lifelong Dodger fan, and I've gone to LA so many times to visit family and go to Dodger games. And again, that's what I explained in the acknowledgments. Orange County was always this place that I passed through. If we ever stopped, it was only for Disneyland or, Tommy's Hamburgers in Westminster as we're going to Dodger Stadium or coming back, right? Because it's almost not quite halfway, but we're getting the munchies by about that point. And so as I realized in Danny's class that, wow, my home is a place that's rich in history. That's Southern California, and all these issues that I begin to learn about in my upper division classes in UC San Diego, the history of race and ethnicity, that impact, the history of immigration, all these. By then, again, I'm an adult. I mean, I am like in my late 20s, is it? And so I'm like not like a 18-year-old. I've lived a bit, had a couple careers. I'm living through the war and terror, right? I'm trying to really get the whole militarization of the borders. My life, when I moved to San Diego, that's the 90s, and so I'm getting all these much more information about my life, and I realized I can study this place. So as I decide, okay, I can study Southern California, I can do race, ethnicity, and I'm getting interested in Latino and migrant history. Um, Eventually, I have to pick an undergraduate. I do a couple of undergraduate research projects, and that's on immigration early. But I need to do something more historical for a history honors thesis, and I choose the Mendez case because I had read about that. And then well, I was actually interested in another group called the Community Service Organization that were LA based. There's a connection between the people involved in Mendez and the birth of the Community Service Organization. And I become aware of that. So I write my undergraduate thesis essentially on the person and some people connected between that. And that's what pulls me into Orange County, initially, is that undergraduate thesis that is realizing that there's a lot more to this Mendez story, which is this class action lawsuit, of course, that the book leads up to, than what the current literature says.
This you may be the first person who wrote a dissertation and book that directly stems from, like, undergraduate kind of senior capstone paper. I don't know if I've ever seen this before. We so many of us get I mean, and you've had plenty of detours and other things you've worked on, but so many of us get pulled in some very different direction. I think that's really I think it's really interesting. So let's get into the book a little bit, and maybe we should lay out the general contours of two kind of major ideas before exploring how the citrus industry leads to the segregation of society in Orange County and how that segregation was challenged. And the two things I thought that we should talk on a little bit, as some listeners probably are not familiar with a lot of this history, is the history of citrus in the region, and then how the industry comes to dominate everything in society there in Orange County. So Orange County is late to the citrus game. Can you walk us through some of the developments? And I've heard you speak on this before, and of course I read it in the book, but there's some specific developments with the Valencia orange that I don't think anybody knows about that leads to this radical transformation in Orange County.
Yeah, the Valencia is a very niche, Southern California, I think, development. And that's part of the reason why I stuck with Orange County. Um, in graduate school, because that wasn't my plan. My plan was to pivot, and it was to do LA. I mean, that's why I went to the University of Southern California. It had, two of the best, right, if you will, right? historians of California and LA, Bill Deverell, George Sanchez. I mean, that's who I went to study with to become an LA historian. And that's the literature that I became just completely enmeshed in. And again, the community service organization was an LA based organization that eventually spread throughout the state. So the plan was to do the CSO, to write that book on the CSO that we're still waiting for. Um, Things didn't work out, if you will, for various reasons. I'm not going to go into details on that. But also, as I continue to think about this project, there's just something different about Orange County that the literature didn't pick up enough on. And this is where you're getting to the power of a single industry to not just dominate the economy, but eventually dominate society. It becomes more and more apparent to me that the citrus industry, although there's this citrus belt that extends from the coast of Los Angeles all the way to Riverside, that's west to east, right, and then north to south from roughly Santa Barbara, down to San Diego. They're growing citrus all over there, right, all over that region, but predominantly the big money makers are from the San Gabriel Valley, so just east of LA, to Riverside. That's where the navel reigns supreme. And as the industry starts to develop in Orange County, Orange County is like breadbasket itself. If you can get water to it, they could grow anything, and they did. Walnuts were very big. Sugar beets, lima beans. You could grow anything, and now the thing is, they're also competing with those other agricultural areas throughout that citrus belt. And so as Orange County comes into the citrus game, roughly in the late 1870s, 1880s, they're trying to compete with Riverside and the San Gabriel Valley, which is already dominating the navel. That's the thicker, or the orange with the thicker rind, right? Much easier to peel. And then Ventura and San Diego counties do better, and somewhat kind of Corona and Riverside County do better growing lemons. Lemons are pretty particular, and so they can grow all that in Orange County, but it's how do they really make room in this market for them? And they discover, and the person that discovers it, his name is Charles C. Chapman. He discovers that the key to the Valencia, other people had grown it. He's not the first in Orange County and in Southern California, but he realizes you can leave the Valencia orange on the tree for months after it's already ripe. And this is crucial because the early part of the citrus industry is really cannibalistic. They are not well organized. They are dealing with all sorts of, the constraints of trying to have an agricultural industry. How do you get water? Dealing with climate. But the big things are how do you deal with the railroads? So shipping rates, right? Um, Cost of labor, of course, is a big one. And then the Eastern fruit brokers and dealers dominate the pricing and everything. And so this competition that leads, it's really like cannibalistic in the citrus industry. And the key is that orange growers in Orange County, California, in Orange County, realize the Valencias are key. There's something about our topography and our soil, and this industry is very scientifically, management organized and run, and they're using science coming out of the citrus, experiment station, which becomes UC Riverside eventually. So they're very much into scientific methodology and discovering what's going to work and how. And so the Valencia, that it can stay on the tree until you don't need to pick it, until the glut of the oranges in the market decreases and you're no longer competing with navels. This is the key discovery in Orange County by Charles C. Chapman. And when that discovery is made, virtually all of the orange growers switch entirely to Valencias. They still do grow some other types of Mediterranean sweet oranges and other deciduous fruits, but it comes to dominate most fruit growers, right? And agriculturalists. And so that's the key shift. And it leads, again, the people that own property, right? You have to understand it in Orange County are mostly making money off of that property by growing something, right? And selling it. Very agricultural. The other way that the land could make you money in these years, because this is right, the suburban boom. And of course, there's a type of suburban type of growth and extension coming from LA. it's not just, the housing is not what makes Orange County money or even Southern LA yet. In the 1930s, a lot of these groves in LA and agricultural land in LA starts to transition to suburban-like developments, but that doesn't happen in Orange County until 30 years later, really until the 1960s. And so as agricultural is the base, there's also oil. There's an oil boom. Ironically, outside of Huntington Beach, most of the oil is in the citrus producing regions, nor in the inland and northern portions of the county around Fullerton, Placentia, etc. They just come to hit strike gold twice, right? With their land that can be very productive in growing Valencia oranges and also um, has some very nice oil underneath it.
And you also write how they also then have this they figure out how to, juice and freeze the juice, which then because these are so the fact that you can leave it on the tree for a couple months, you figure out how to juice and freeze it. This allows you to then put your product onto the market when the supply has dropped and prices are gonna be the best for you. You don't wanna put it out there when everyone else puts their oranges out there.
Right, because by the early 1910s, actually, right, the major citrus orchidists, they call themselves, or a citrus, I call them citrus capitalists, because they were capitalists and they actually call themselves capitalists. And many times in like their voting records, when they had
Mm.
registered to vote, like one year, this citrus grower is a citrus farmer. Then the next year, he's a real estate investor. Then the next year, he's just a capitalist. Right. And so it's really interesting to see, use that kind of track. How did they view themselves and think of themselves? Um, but the key is they realized that by the 1910s, by World War One, scientifically, they've done everything they need to do to really hit the peak of their market in regards to who's consuming oranges. Oranges are rather exotic, right? And not a lot of people consume them. And so they have to lead to these elaborate marketing campaigns to convince people to eat oranges, right? Because they're overproducing, right, their market. And that's where orange juice becomes crucial, particularly for Orange County and those massive, again, marketing campaigns that citrus growers, by this time, they had formed into growers associations. So this is crucial. This is what, you know, leads out of that chaotic era and the so-called red ink years where it was hard to make a profit growing citrus and put them into the black years because they became like massive collectivist organizations, whereby they controlled everything horizontally from what it was needed, from the lumber that was needed to, produce the crates that they packed and shipped oranges to, to specialized clippers, the canvas bags, I mean, everything. They own the water companies. They formed the banks that are, they're getting all their crop loans from. You name it. It's completely vertically integrated, and it's all controlled through what's called the collectivist, again, grower association. The most prominent of which becomes the California Fruit Growers Exchange, which creates the brand Sunkist. So branding fruit, I don't think orange growers were the first ones to do it, but they universalized it and made it the university standard where a brand was associated with a particular grade. And Charles C. Chapman, no oranges were more respected than his. His actually were outside of the Sunkist brand. He had his own brand, and they secured the highest prices on the market. But again, the growers associations are the one that are now, since it's all these, they're the ones that build all the packing houses, and so a growers association is associated, connected to a packing house. It could be as few as 5 growers, or it could be hundreds, depending on how big the packing house was. And then they had, so it's a three-tiered structure: that packing house, packing association at the bottom. Then they had the distributors in the middle section, and so they're the ones that are arranging the contracts and identifying where these are going to be shipped to. Then you have the highest portion of the executive level. The point is, all of this is run actually from the bottom up by citrus growers, and the most prominent growers that are producing the most and the best are the ones that eventually get into the leadership. This is all important again because it's what helps stabilize the citrus industry and make it so enormously profitable. Even during the early years of the Great Depression, citrus growers are hitting records in 1930, 1931, even 1932. Um, and that crucially to how this leads from an economic to a more social type of dominance, they essentially have to understand Orange County is a company town. not just one single town, right? It's one single portion of it, but because of the power of these growers, they all become, they become elected officials. They're the ones that lead the charge for Orange County to separate from Los Angeles. And so, whether you're an orange grower or not, you're connected to the citrus industry and dependent, and you have an interest there. Its success means your success, and that's why I make that comparison to it being a company town.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. At one point, you're right. Leaders of local grower associations partnered with other regional elites to run Orange County like a company town, picking winners and losers based on a shared vision of how resources would be used to promote urban and economic growth. So, on the ground, for say an average citizen, and you've already hinted at this a little bit, how does this function in your day to day life in the company town idea of the county being run that way? Ho Let's say that you're a teacher, you're an insurance salesman, whatever it is, how are these orange grower associations, a part of your life, visibly or not
Mhm.
visibly?
First of all, the most populous region of the county, which is the inland to northern portion of the county, everything from, say, Santa Ana, Garden Grove up, which would you move up to then Anaheim, Buena Park, Fullerton, Placentia, what's now Yorba Linda, all the way up to La Habra. Um, this is the citrus producing region. So every city is surrounded by orange groves. And yes, again, there's other forms of agricultural production, but it is the dominant visualization that you have, right? So you see it everywhere and you realize, right? Just like, what I grew up around. I grew up in San Diego. The military dominated. That was the
Mm.
industry. And I took it for granted. I didn't realize this, of course, as a kid. I didn't
It kind of
realize,
fades into the background
right.
sometimes if something is so ubiquitous, you don't think about it consciously.
Exactly, exactly. So that's part of this, right? That you're seeing the citrus groves everywhere. So many of the people that they may not be a citrus picker or a citrus grower, but maybe they're a fumigator. Maybe they're a construction worker, right? Again, all these roads lead back to the citrus industry. Again, where's your water coming from? It's coming from whatever water district was chartered by citrus growers, right? Where do you bank? It's coming from a bank that was chartered by citrus growers, right?
Who's dominating your city
Yeah,
council?
and exactly.
Who's dominating school
The county
boards?
board of
Who's
supervisors,
board of
exactly.
education? Everything, right?
The chambers of commerce are run by citrus growers, right? Yes. And so that's why for a lot of people, it's kind of, as you mentioned, that's a good point. It's in the background, but it's ever present. You know people that are tied to citrus, whether you specifically or not.
So for people who have studied a little bit about, Western history and they're familiar with company towns in, the examples of like, the lumber industry or mining where a certain mine like controlled everything in the city or railroads in certain places uh, kind of run everything. Is this a pretty close, like analogous example? Um, or are there any like important distinctions or can we think about them in pretty similar terms?
I would, yes. And so, yes, I'd say where things would be different, right? A company town, the typical picture of it, right? It's smaller. There's one single industry. Everybody works for that industry, right? And so
It's
I'm
an
drawing
actual town.
an actual town, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm very intentionally drawing that comparison to say really whether people realize or not, you're all in hawk with this industry, right? But it's much more it can be much more indirect, right? And a bit more subtle for some people. Not everyone has to shop at the same store, if you will, right? So a
Whereas
company
in a
towns
mining company town, they do.
exactly.
And
Right.
here they're not using company script instead of actual money,
Exactly.
but I think it's really interesting scaled up to think about
Exactly.
how in some ways it actually is functioning similarly.
Yes,
Um,
because again, right, if you need a loan to start a business, that loan, that bank is dependent upon the citrus industry. Many of your customers and your clientele, and definitely the most influential people are going to be prominent citrus growers. Because if you're running a small business, you're part of the chambers of commerce. Who's running the chamber of commerce again? That's citrus growers, right? So, you take I again, if you're a teacher, maybe that's your profession, and your husband could be a wage laborer doing something that's not citrus based, but the people running the school board are citrus growers.
Well, we need to introduce the immigrant labor to the scene then. So, in the 19 teens and 20s, there's increasingly more and more restrictive immigration laws being passed, which impacts this industry. And so they're on the hunt for a more stable workforce to maximize profits. And they turn primarily to Mexican and Mexican American uh, immigrant labor. Where in that early era, teens, 20s, where are they coming from? Are they already in the United States working in other agricultural industries, or are lots of them fresh arrivals from across the border?
The Mexicans themselves? Yes, most of them come. I mean, so obviously California was part of Mexico, and so you have Californio Mexicans, and there had been levels of migration northward from Mexico to Southern California prior to this. But really, the kickoff is the Mexican Revolution, right? Which is essentially a civil war and going on in Mexico. And so that leads to estimates of over 1.5 million Mexican migrants fleeing northward during the socioeconomic and political dislocations of that struggle. And that happens to coincide again with this really booming era, right, of in the second, citrus gold rush, as they refer to it, as citrus historians refer to it, occurs during this period where and that overlaps with World War One, as you mentioned, these increasing immigration restrictions that emanate out of World War One and those fears from the 1917 Immigration Nationalization Act to the national origin quota systems, which arises in 1921 and 24. That essentially cuts off all the labor from Asia, which there were a lot of Chinese laborers initially. They it wasn't so, monolithic like it becomes, but Chinese labor was very important in Orange County early on, particularly in the citrus industry. The earliest kind of big citrus growers like Richard H. Gilman, he brings in Chinese laborers to help him build, their massive ranch. Um, um, a semi-tropical fruit company, I think it was. If I'm getting that one right, I might be a bad reference. But anyways,
And there are also Japanese, Filipino.
Japanese,
There was,
Filipino.
yeah.
So you have a very racially diverse and Southern and Eastern, European labor. But again, all that labor kind of dries up in ways, at least that's what citrus growers are saying, due to these different forces. And so most of these Mexicans that are coming, they realize, right, we can attract them. And the key is, how do we do it? How do we get them? Because they could be, a solution to this labor problem, which again, by this time, again, the Citrus Growers Associations are controlling all the hiring and the pay of the citrus workers. So it doesn't matter whether me myself say I'm a independent citrus grower, or not independent, but I have my own little 5-acre plot of land, and there's another person over there which 20-acre citrus ranch was really big, because land is so expensive in Southern California, right? So you have people from the Midwest selling hundreds of acres to buy 10 or 20 in Southern California. So that 20 acres were bigger, and some were bigger than that, but that was rare. The point is that all the labor is already contracted and controlled through the growers associations by the time they are searching for what's going to help us stabilize our labor problem. That is the dearth of labor as they see it, because you need a semi-permanent labor force for citrus. It's not the migrant labor force that just
Just for
picking
the
grapes
harvest
is for the
or
harvest,
something.
right?
Yeah.
You need people to maintain it for several months, and there is an off season. It's a summer ripening orange, so there is an off season usually during the winter, and that's when these Valencias are hitting the market. Um, but yeah,
So we need to pivot now to kind of the main, I mean, one of the real important contributions of the book, which is how this turns into a civil rights story. You write that citrus was to Orange County what cotton and tobacco were to the South, that they were, quote, the driver of migration, investment, urban growth, and then important for the story, inequality. So there's no formalized black codes like there was in
nope.
earlier eras in the South, but you do identify 48 very intentionally and clearly segregated neighborhoods in Orange County. So how do these come into existence, and where are they located in relation to some other suburban not segregated suburban development in Orange County?
As the Mexican migration is increasing, the key is how to attract Mexican labor. And when I mean Mexican, they're referring to family labor. This is not as they're not after a single male workforce. They realized early on, and how do we know this? Because it's in their publications. The most prominent, perhaps agricultural publication in the country, but at least in the West and certainly in California, is the California Citrograph. Uh, Ironically, there's dozens of years of the California Citrograph sitting in the archives and stacks here at BYU, just showing you how important that publication was to other agricultural producing regions, because of again, it was the epitome of scientific management that they were using and how to run this industry like a business. So they realize and they advocate in their publication, beginning in like the mid 19 teens, if we model our growth model and to attract Mexican labor like some of these big ranches. These big citrus ranches have grower provided housing. And this is how they do it. They set up in this way. You have barracks here, you have little homes here. And the key to that is that the housing in these big citrus ranches, and these are the guys that are running the California Fruit Growers Exchange, or this is what becomes known as Sunkist, um, they segregate all of that housing to avoid labor problems. This is very common, right? In early 20th century, late 19th century America, and racial exploitation of labor is not nothing new to the country or even to the agricultural production. But it's how do we use this as a technology? How do we use this as a business practice to produce the most? And they advocate for scaling this up. Now, most growers do not have enough land to build grower provided housing. And so what they start, so that's one way. If you do build grower provided housing, so like in La Habra, several colonias, develop little villages, citrus worker villages that are all tied to the La Habra Citrus Growers Association. Um, and in some other places in Fullerton, like the Bradford Brothers or Chapman, again, Chapman's own orange, they're big enough to do that. But if you're not, then they advocate, well, you can also let's use private development. So build private subdivisions that are explicitly segregated and only sold to Mexican citrus workers. So that's the second type of housing that they use to attract Mexican labor. And the third type is just standard kind of like working class neighborhoods that are usually turned over by whatever dominant form of labor is needed. And so that's like in, Santa Ana. There's like several very working class and older neighborhoods where a lot of Mexicans were already living, and other forms of migrant, not migrant labor, but working class labor. And so in the publications themselves, they basically say, give a place for these people to live, right? Make it affordable. We'll keep it segregated, keep them away from white laborers, Japanese, Chinese laborers, right? Because that's just going to cause labor problems. And that footprint becomes the basis. And again, that's happening in the inland portion of the county, all the way up to the northern portion of the county. It's happening in urban cities like Anaheim or Orange or Santa Ana, but it's really predominating in the really golden district from what's like Buena Park all the way to Yorba Linda and La Habra. Those are very, very rural, and so that's where they're doing a lot of the private subdivisions that are being sold exclusively to Mexican citrus workers. And the key is they recognize that if we can attract families, then we're going to solve our labor problem, because we're going to have generations of worker. And they literally say this in their own publication. I have a picture of it in one of the chapters of my book, where in the citrograph they're pointing to a family standing in front of this little stick-built hut, um, where they have their own little garden and they can have chickens running around, which is what they talk about in the publication, because that way they can feed themselves during the off season. And the caption says, "Here's 3 generations of labor," and they're referring to the children that can't even walk yet. And so this
Is
is what you
labor.
see as labor. You see their mindset. How do we preserve this system? And it's what eventually transitions to the other social institutions that they incorporate into this, like schools, creating segregated school systems, right, that are clearly unequal and are not meant to really educate these children on a pathway to social mobility that would lead them to high school or something like that. It's a system that was ingrained within an already residentially segregated system that was meant to provide and house and maintain labor for the dominant citrus economy, and then they built an educational system on top of that that complemented it.
That would lead these not yet labor-aged, kids to become a labor force in the future, right?
Exactly, and one of the way they
Yeah.
did that is, for example, in these Mexican schools, to get through the first grade would take to get through every elementary grade took 2 years for a Mexican child, as opposed to one. So you had grade 1A and grade 1B, right? Grade 2A, grade 2B. So by the time they finished elementary school, these kids are well into their teenage years, and that creates two pressures. Number one, they start to get the sense of, well, I'm already so much older. If I went to middle school, I'm way older than these kids, right? And then there's also the economic pressure that their family is now placing on them because you're old enough to work. And now they have been working their lives as children, as supplemental labor. That's one of the pictures on my book cover is of a bunch of boys, the Vasquez boys, that are, picking oranges. They're referred to as ratas, which is literally translates into rats, because they scurried around picking like the low-hanging fruit or picking things off the ground. You couldn't really sell an orange that fell on the ground. You could juice it, but you couldn't sell it, as something nice. But so they were working already at early years. The school system, the hours were set so children could pick a little in the morning, right, and then go to school and then pick in the afternoon. So the whole educational system was structured around child labor, family labor. But again, by the time they're getting through elementary school, it's, economically and even socially, it's the pressure is to leave school. And it was explicitly built to do that is the important thing to understand.
But by the time we get to the 1930s, 1940s, we now have a couple generations who've gone through, have grown, raised families, families turned over, another generation. We do start to see some of these Mexican American families and individuals getting involved in politics and social organizing, in doing things outside of just picking fruit. And this is where the second half of your book then kind of pivots to lead us to this landmark 1945 case, Mendez et al. Versus the Westminster School District. Um, can you tell us really, because I want to make sure we have time to talk about the Mendez case, but what are some of the key developments in the broader Mexican American political organizing, social organizing world that lays a foundation for this case, which then challenges the segregated school system?
So as the Mexican population's numbers grow, they are large enough. They are the largest demographic minority in the county. At minimum, 15% of the county is Mexican. Upwards, some estimates are as high as 20%. Um,
But in localized places,
it can be
they
higher.
are,
Yeah, it could
yeah.
be higher or lower. Yeah, and this is mostly again in the inland to northern section of the county. But they start to realize, okay, and and very early on, the Santa Ana School District starts advocating and segregating Mexican students into different classrooms as early as 1912, and by 1919, they are having board meetings and they want to build and they do build their own a separate segregated school. Mexican parents get wind of this. And they fight it automatically. They go before the school board and they challenge them. You can't do this. This is discriminatory. This is illegal, to the point that the Santa Ana School Board has to bring in the county attorney and to advise them, can we actually do this? Because state law in California, the education code doesn't say you can segregate Mexican kids. You can segregate Asians and Native Americans, but not Mexicans. And they find a reason that they can do it. We can do this pedagogically. We'll claim, right? They're not intellectually the same or the same intellectual abilities as white American children. So we can do this. So segregation is a long issue, and particularly in educational segregation. A lot of these neighborhoods were affordable. It somewhat made sense that they're in these neighborhoods, right? But then they don't really realize how much until they get into adulthood, how much they're locked into these neighborhoods, right? Until they try to buy a home outside of the barrio, if you or colonia, if you're able to achieve that type of socioeconomic, right, mobility. So a few do realize, oh, we can't buy out of these areas. So there's discrimination within the real estate industry. More and more it becomes apparent We are in these segregated spaces. We are treated as an underclass, as a minority. And so this leads to several grassroots organizations in the 1930s and early 1940s that I track in my third chapter that start to lay the base of Mexican American grassroots civic engagement because they're locked out of these systems, if you will, and these organizations in the county, and they're not being taught to being active political subjects in schools. They form these organizations like La Sociedad Progresista Mexicana or the Mexican YMCA clubs that becomes the Mexican American movement. Um, they form these themselves to educate themselves about their civic rights and duties and to advocate for them to become more politically engaged.
But you also see then the Latin American Voters League forming with desegregation as a real core goal that they had, trying to build voting coalitions to get their people onto school boards to work from within the system to change this. But there's a real tension because even if they want to bring a case forward, say, um, to to challenge the segregated schools, you have to find families to, like, represent the case. You have to find people that are willing to stand up, but that might mean them losing their jobs, even if they don't work for a grower but they work at a bank. But the bank is controlled or they may not then be able to get loans. Because the citrus industry controls everything, it's gonna be hard for the Latin American Voters League to find working class people to stand up and be the representatives for the case, but they eventually do. So tell us, how does this 1945 case, play out?
Yes, as you mentioned, so these grassroots organizations lead to in the early 40s of the formation of the Latin American Voters League, and that those group of people that form that group have the explicit intention to impact voting, for the purposes of desegregation. And so they're essential to building this movement. They go around, they're led by a man by the name of Hector Tarango, and he's a man that I focus a lot on, but there are others that are with him, Manuel Vega Jr. They're essentially a type of ethnic middle class that is formed in Orange County. They're not pickers themselves. One of them is a sales clerk at a J.C. Penney, but that's like a middle class job, right? It's white collar, and so these men and their wives don't get as much attention. They become much more active when they form other groups like LULAC later. But these men and women of this kind of ethnic middle class, they're the ones that have the time, and the mindset. And there have been labor organizing prior, so there's other forms of activism, but they're the ones that go around and essentially start to identify who are people that are willing to fight and to form a movement. They view themselves as a movement, and they essentially connect with families that had individually protested before the school districts before. Mexican American women, most importantly, I think were we must acknowledge were the ones that encountered segregation and pushed back from it at the very outset because these are the ones that are usually going to school to enroll their children. Men did do this, but a lot of times it was the women in the family that were enrolling their children, and they're the ones who would ask the attendance clerk, or why can't my kid go to this school? And then they would speak to the principal or the superintendent. But so Latin Americans Voter League is the one that's crucial for connecting all these independent struggles. These people, they find the five plaintiff families, if you will, or they connect with them, the Guzman family, the Ramirez family, the Mendez family, Palomino, Estrada. They connect all of them. And they start holding meetings. They start appearing unified before the school district. They are explicitly saying this is racial discrimination. We know you are enforcing discrimination arbitrarily. You're not testing our children. Our children can speak English.
Because the language was something that the school board said, "Oh, no, this is just language, segregation," but no, the kids all speak English.
Yes, the kids speak English. And so they were able to prove that over and over and over again. And the point is the school boards continuously, and there's four school boards that are pulled into this class action lawsuit. It's the Westminster School District, the Santa Ana, Garden Grove, and El Medina. And it's crucial that now Orange County had at this time like nearly 50, a little over 50. In the early 30s they had 44 school districts. Of those 44 school districts, 11 of them had purpose-built Mexican schools.
Often, like, right next to a new there's, like, a new white school, and then the old school that's run down.
Yeah,
These moms show up with their kids to enroll them, and they're like, "Oh, sorry, you need to go across the
right there.
parking lot to
Yeah.
that old rundown one," right? But other
Yes.
times you say that there were some where it was segregation within a school?
Exactly. So the school districts that didn't have enough money to say they couldn't pass a bond, they couldn't convince voters to pass a bond to build a new school where they'd put the white kids in and then they would leave the Mexicans in the old school, they would segregate within the school system. And that's like I said, what Santa Ana started doing in 1912. And so by the 1920s and 30s, this is common practice. So the estimates, it's high 80 percentage, right, of Mexican children are being segregated into a separate classroom or a separate school. This is a systemic issue, and this is what the five plaintiff families accuse the school districts of doing. They have conspired together. The charge is right to discriminate and segregate us illegally, and this is a key question in the case. Um, Segregation is legal. That's not a problem. Plessy versus Ferguson had been the law of the land for 50 years, and the judge, Paul J. McCormick, notices this at the very beginning and says, okay, this is not about whether segregation is legal or not. It's legal. The question is this discriminatory in that is it ethnic or race based, which is really a problem for them and a conundrum for them to handle because legally Mexicans are technically white, and that's because of like immigration law and decisions and naturalization law. They're of course not socially white, but that's what they have to prove essentially. The plaintiff families have to prove that we're being racially discriminated against, even though we're supposedly white. We're a class other than whiteness. And the four school districts themselves were chosen as representative of the types of segregation that existed all throughout the county. This was widely acknowledged by Paul J. McCormick, the federal district court judge in Los Angeles, which is where this is filed. And this is why they filed it in federal district court because it's not just a county case. So, again, it's the initial argument from the school districts are, well, this lacks standing. Education is a state issue, not a federal issue. But the families, through their attorney, are claiming our 14th Amendment equal protection rights are being violated, as is our Fifth Amendment due process rights. You're taking things away from us that you don't have the right to do that. And the Constitution protects us against that. And so again, they select these four particular school districts, not because they're the only school districts doing it, but because they are representative of the different types of segregation that would prove, as the plaintiffs are seeing this, that this is arbitrary segregation that is racially and ethnic based. Arbitrary in that it's not tied to pedagogy. There's no testing system. There is no system that actually allows for a Mexican child to advance from a Mexican school to a white school. And that's the charge of collusion.
And it's also arbitrary, it's not even geographically segregated because they found that there are Mexican kids who are actually having to cross school boundaries, like, being forced to attend Mexican schools outside of their actual school district boundaries, right?
Yeah, the good way to see is that these districts are all gerrymandered. So if
Yeah.
we you get that picture of right, that should do it. They're gerrymandered to keep Mexicans in there and allow even other racial minorities, Asians, African Americans, to go to so-called integrated white schools. They could do that. Some Japanese and black students did go to Mexican schools. That was because of proximity or something, but they could go to white schools. Mexicans, when they made that petition, were almost universally denied. This system was somewhat permeable. Some families that were able to claim a more European Spanish ancestry, maybe they had a little more money, they were able to get an exception, to this segregationist system. But the working class, the more brown you were, the more clearly Mexican or Mexican you were perceived to be, you were denied. Didn't matter how intelligent you were. And this came out in the court. There was a girl in the El Medina School District who was brilliant. Even the superintendent, and all these superintendents have to testify in the court, right? They're
Mhm.
questioned. And he admits, Carol Torres is perhaps the most brilliant student I've ever taught. And so interestingly, the question then comes to him, well, why didn't you ever suggest that she move to the Mexican school? I mean, to the white school, which was in El Medina, it was just next door. The two schools are next to each other. And he says, "Well, the thought never came to my mind. It never occurred to me," which was so ironic because, um, you know, that was the whole claim. These students are segregated because they cannot compete. And so then he leaned on, Well, the reason why we didn't do that is because then also there'd be this sense of inferiority. Like we didn't want them. I don't think he used the word inferiority, but he used the word as like they wouldn't feel like they belonged in a school unless they had other children that look like him. So then that becomes the backup plan. Well, we don't want to make students uncomfortable, even if they are intellectually, capable, um, and academically capable. We don't want them to be uncomfortable by being so well outnumbered. So they're leaning on both of these. Right? They're grabbing at straws to justify their segregation system.
So, in the aftermath of it being ruled against the school districts, what's the I mean, we don't have a lot of time to go through this, and your book doesn't this is kinda beyond the primary scope of your book, but I think listeners wanna know, like, so what happened? Like, in the next say, 5 to 10 years, how is this ruling then applied on the ground?
So initially in 1946, the case is filed in March of 1945. It's decided in um, in 1946, I think in the spring of 1946, at the federal district court level, Judge McCormick finds in favor of the plaintiff families and enjoins the school districts from their segregationist practices. Basically, is telling them you need to integrate. Well, they refuse to do so. All but well, one of the school districts kind of like cops out and says, "Okay, we'll play ball." That's Westminster, but the other ones are like, "No, we're going to stick to this." So it gets appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in 1946, and then that decision comes down in late spring of 1947, upholding the decision to desegregate um, these schools. It's incredibly influential because, it's there's both. There's a limited impact because they have to continue to fight, and I described this. Yeah, they have to continue to fight and to force all the other school districts now in Orange County to desegregate, and so that activism continues, and it spurs the growth of, the League of United Latin American Citizens, throughout, Orange County, which is a Texas-based civil rights organization, the largest at the time for Mexican Americans. It is the oldest Latino civil rights organization in our country today. It's kind of like the NAACP, if you will, for Latinos and Mexicans. So that movement to build these chapters expands throughout the county and throughout Southern California. And it's driven by these people that were brought into activism by the desegregation movement. And so I narrate that story into the conclusion, into the mid 1960s, to show how this provides a pathway into, electoral reform and Mexicans getting elected to school boards, to mayoral offices, influencing California politics, getting appointments from California governors. Even President Kennedy appoints the first Mexican American postmaster general, and he's from Santa Ana. He's from this LULAC base. He becomes the eventual president. He was the president of LULAC, the national organization. So I describe how this desegregationist movement goes on to spur in Southern California the growth of the Mexican American civil rights movement that eventually connects to what we refer to the Chicano and then latter immigrant rights Latino movement.
But as this suggests, like, there's still a long fight that
Yeah,
continues, but it opens the door. Um,
exactly.
so so if we zoom way out to maybe start concluding, um, you make a lot of really important and fascinating interventions here. You center Orange County as a site of important agricultural development, right, instead of LA or Central Valley or, broader histories of agriculture in California. You're asserting, hey, Orange County is kind of a black hole here that no one's talked about, and it was actually really important. And similarly, there's lots of that's been written um, on Mexican American civil rights in Southern California. But you're saying, hey, we need to pay attention here to Orange County because it really played this important role. It gives us a really interesting comparison to think about with Brown v. Board and
Exactly.
African American civil rights movements. There's so much here, and it boggles the mind that this book had not been written before because after I've, read through it, like, it's right there. It's so obvious. I think the significance of these stories, and it's really wild that they hadn't been given. I know people have written about some of these things in
Right.
various ways before.
Yeah.
This isn't a brand new story that you discovered.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. It's there's some great, really good literature that I stand on the shoulders of, certainly, Gilbert Gonzales, Elizabeth Haas. But truly, Orange County was, yes, grossly understudied, and it remains grossly understudied and under theorized today because it's always been in the shadow, right, of LA. And that's something that I realized, right, throughout this project of, from grad school to now, that being in the shadow of LA has obscured people that have phenomenal things. I mean, look at this movement. This movement wasn't led by one person. We're currently in the aftermath of the Cesar Chavez allegations and the problems of attaching movements to charismatic leaders or even our history, our national history. We're always pointing to like the great men, so to speak, rather than seeing how history is driven from the ground up. And I mean, look at what these people did. They were most of them, a lot of them come from immigrant backgrounds. We're in a massive xenophobic backlash, if you will, in our current society. And the supposition is that well, immigrants don't assimilate. What did these people do? They
They're fighting to
assimilated,
assimilate. They're
and they then it just like to assimilate, they upheld our legal institutions, our educational institutions. They put meaning behind the 14th Amendment. They did it, not someone in Congress, right? Not some, great individual leader. Collectively, they did it as a movement. And individually, these people all have their flaws. All people do. And again, it's the problem of just emphasizing so much on one person. And so much of what this book tries to do is to promote that, what I refer to as that at all perspective, which is history from a community perspective, from multiple historical actors that are all just ordinary people. None of these people were professionally trained activists. Some of them became that. Because of their participation, some of these people became big movers and shakers in the Democratic Party, or even in Republican circles. As even back then, Mexicans, Latinos are a swing vote that both parties in the 50s and 60s start to appeal to. But it's that view of that the ordinary, the mundane person, the mundane organizations, right? There's the meetings in a church or a neighborhood store. That's where our nation's most values have been upheld. This notion of equality was taught among Mexican grassroots organizations, and they believed in it even when everything around them told them this is bogus. They believed in it, and they tried to create a movement, and they did, and they succeeded. They did desegregate. Yes, the movement continued and problems continued, but they accomplished their goals, and in large part, they benefited the rest of the country for doing it.
I mean, I was gonna ask to as a kind of a final question, but I think you've maybe already answered it. I was gonna say if we zoom out and people interested in the West, like what are the questions they should be thinking about in their own community's history? But maybe this is one of the core things is, well, think about what grassrootsy things have happened in your community, not just who is that important founder who, built the first log cabin here or something, but what are the collective group movements that happened? It's a really powerful historical lens to apply to reevaluate seemingly familiar known histories of our local communities, right? There's other stories out there that maybe haven't been fully discovered. I think
Yeah,
there's a lot of power in that you give us a really great template for.
I think so. I think we are in a crisis of trust in that's our nation right now in the institutions that have so-called made our country great, if you will. Uh, and the point is that I think we can learn from history. We can see how these institutions were actually strengthened by people that were told that we should be afraid of, or people that have been ignored. That these contributions and these things that we respect and uphold entire values to, and again, as a nation, a lot of this, there's mystique and myth tied to a lot of that stuff. But I mean, here's just real history, right? Here's just an empirical study that shows you what happens when we look from the ground up, and the impacts of people trying to improve not just the conditions for themselves, but eventually for many others.
Well, to wrap up, I know you have some exciting outgrowths of this current project. Can you tell us a little bit about uh, the graphic novel that may be in development on this Mendez story?
Yes, while I was wrapping this up, I was actually working with a student here at BYU, and we started teasing out the idea of because I come from a background of public educators. Both my parents were public educators, and So I've fallen in love with academia. I mean, it's my intellectual home. I mean, I love the deep discussions we get to have, but again, getting this history, to amass a wider audience has always been at the forefront of my mind. How do we do that? This story is so important, not just to Southern California history, but to the West and our nation's history. And so that eventually got me thinking, well, I see my kids reading all these graphic novels and I see adults reading graphic novels. And I started, buying some myself. There's lots of great graphic novels that have come out with history. I mean, like the University of North Carolina Press, like publishes graphic novels in some ways, right? In a a small form. And so, um, that's the next, that's one of the projects that's spurring off of this is um, taking a portion of the story and putting it in a graphic novel form that is really appealing to people of various age groups, and hoping that that'll then expand its footprint and influence. People need to know this story and this history, and I think for the aspects that we focus on in the end, this is not just a story about Latinos or Mexicans. It's a story about our country, and again the institutions we value, and how those things are preserved and expanded.
I think it'll be really exciting to see it reach new audiences in this new form and to see some of the other kinds of ripple effects that there may be. Well, thank you so much for spending a little time. I usually close by, making some offhanded comment about hoping to see someone at a conference someday, but I'll probably just see you in the hallway tomorrow. Well, I
Yeah.
guess tomorrow's Saturday, but yeah, I really appreciate.
Right.
Well, congrats on the book, and it's really great. And thanks for spending some time with us, DJ.
Thanks, Brandon. It was a pleasure.
All right, take care. Thank you again for listening. You can find links to our guests' works in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for my own gain. But increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using and write a review. Follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments. And share episodes with your friends. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, often live streaming them on our YouTube channel. We have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is linked in the show notes. My name is Brendan Rensink, and I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, so you can direct any praise, or more likely critiques, my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and more. My recent titles include a 2018 book, Native But Foreign: Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I recently launched a new series with the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Red Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It is a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more that you can use remotely or on a road trip. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, the Red Center, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org. Email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind.